work for the University of Minnesota, and I do a lot of work with farmers and agricultural professionals, soil and water conservation districts, and we're really interested in soil moisture and soil health. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about soil moisture management, the impacts of cover crops, and residue. So just a nice little outline of what we're going to talk about today. Soil moisture and water balance basics. Now, I'm sure there's lots of folks in this room who got that down, but it's always nice to have a good foundation. We're all on the same page. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about how how management impacts soil moisture, and not only just total moisture, but plant available water. We're also going to talk about how management impacts soil functions, and a lot of the functions that we care about really depend on the size of the pores within the soil and the connectivity of the pores. So we can dive deeper into that topic. Well, first I want to ask, how many of you have tried reducing tillage, no-till, strip-till, just raising hands? How about cover crops? Oh, nice. Okay, maybe you guys should come on up, tell me what you've learned about that. We can wait for that till after. This is a photo I took this fall. I was down in Dakota County, and I was looking down this road, and I noticed that these two fields, they're right across the road from each other. They're the same exact soil type. But as you can see, they're being managed very differently. And ultimately, this is going to impact how they behave or how they function. In this presentation, I'm going to use the word function, behavior. Those are kind of interchangeable. Some of the functions we care about are infiltration, recycling of water, plant distribution of water, and then also water uptake by the plant itself. And as you can see here, one of the fields is no cover. It's going to be tilled in a couple of days after I took this photo. And the other field had this really beautiful oat, rye, and radish cover crop. Now, I will say that this was this past fall, which was really dry, and the farmer luckily had some irrigation, so he was able to get this nice, beautiful stand of this cover crop. And so this will really impact how water moves through the soil and how it moves over the soil. And soils are basically like leaky buckets in some ways. It depends on the water inputs that are actually entering the soil, irrigation being one of the inputs and rainfall the other, but then also the outputs. And the soil water processes, like the pore size distribution and how that impacts infiltration, is another way that water is being moved through the soil. And it's really about balancing those inputs and those outputs, and having really nice processes to actually work within the soil. So if we want to break it down, which factors actually impact soil moisture? You can break it into three basic categories. One, land management, which is what we saw in that last photo, how land management can be so different. Soil properties is another one. So this is something you're not necessarily going to change very easily, like texture. And local conditions, like how much rainfall you get and the slope of your soils. This is ultimately going to impact how much water you're getting in your soils, the air you're getting in your soils, and how the air and water move through that soil structure and pore system. All right, so first, local conditions. So in this area, well, first let me say, I'm actually from the Dakota County area, so this is about a 3-hour drive for me to come up here, but I do have a statewide role, so I do end up around the state, but it's interesting to compare where we're at now versus some of the other places that I'm in. You guys have some interesting climate conditions. Not only do you already have a pretty short growing season, you get about the same amount of evaporation, transpiration, and precipitation. So you're not necessarily always going to get that moisture recharge. It really depends on the year. So trying to balance that soil water balance so you have enough moisture for the crop is super important, especially in these drier areas. And breaking out this fun, good old water holding capacity and soil texture chart, ultimately, why do we care about just not even soil moisture, but water holding capacity and plant available water? So if you look at this chart where we have these different soil textures and the amount of water that can actually be held in the soil, we see that the soil texture really influences how much water is available. Because not all moisture is available to the plant. A good example is that clay has a lot of water, but most of it is held in these really, really tiny pores, so the water is not going to be extracted by the plant. So pore size plays a really important role in soil function and how much moisture you can actually hold in your soil and how much moisture is available to the plant. And texture is something that you're not going to change, like I mentioned. That's kind of inherent to your system. So how can we increase available water? We know it's really important, and that it does depend on the pore size. The available water is mostly held in these kind of medium-sized pores, but we do need a good mix of pore sizes to actually achieve some of those functions that we care about, like getting moisture into the subsoil and getting it to our crop roots. This is a better way I like to show the water holding capacity, because I think it's nice to give this more of a, I don't want to say 3D, but kind of like side view of what's actually going on, where the macropores are moving the water when it's saturated, and then the wilting point is water's being held so tightly we can't actually access it, and it's in that middle area where we are getting that available plant water. But texture's not changing, but soil structure is. And soil structure is impacted by your management. And soil structure not only changes the pore size, it also changes the pore connectivity of your soils. So soil texture is fixed, but structure can be improved. This is a schematic of what will happen if you have the same exact soil type, but you manage them very differently. On the left-hand side, we see this more degraded soil or a less healthy soil, where at this point, because of the consistent disturbance of the soil and a lack of residue cover, we get a lot of breakdown of the soil aggregates in the soil structure. We also see then that as a result, we're getting crusting. The water is just going to run off the surface, and you're not going to get a lot of infiltration. So your plant's going to have more crop stress as a result. In the soil on the right, we see a healthier soil. This soil has these nice soil aggregates, the soil structure, and not only are there larger pores that are really well connected to infiltrate the water deeper into the subsoil, into the plant rooting zone, there's also a mix of smaller pores where water is being stored. So in the soil on the right is where we can increase our plant available water and water holding capacity relative to the soil on the left that has much smaller pore spaces and fewer pore spaces in general. Okay, so back to this. We know we can't really change local conditions. We just kind of got to deal with when we get rain, when we get it. We know we can't change soil properties like texture, kind of inherent to the system, but we can change and control our land management. So whether or not we're using tillage or whether or not we're using cover crops. So there are different tools within our toolbox in terms of how we might manage soil moisture. And I'm going to talk to you mostly about the residue, the tillage, and the cover crop aspect of soil moisture management, but there's a bunch of other things, and it sounds like a lot of irrigators here. That's another way you can manage soil moisture. Tile drainage is, when I'm in the southern part of the state, that's huge. I'm sure there's some in the area too. But it's really a balancing act of balancing the water inputs and the water outputs. And I'm going to show you how some of these tools, residue, tillage, and cover crop, can positively and kind of negatively impact the soil moisture. It's really about managing those trade-offs. That's really, in many ways, agriculture is about trying to use the tools at our disposal effectively. So hopefully we can try to have better impacts on our soil moisture and soil water processes. And cover crops and reduced tillage are not just management tools. They really are soil health principles, or they fall under these soil health principles. And I guess I'm curious, how many of you have heard of these principles before? Couple? Okay, cool. Well, maybe learn some more here. First one, keeping the soil covered with this above ground biomass. And I'll show you guys this nice little root box that we have. Keeping this soil covered above ground and below ground. And that also is keeping the living roots in the ground. You want to minimize disturbance by reducing tillage and keeping more residue on the surface. You want to increase crop diversity in time that you're keeping the ground covered. And integrating livestock is a huge benefit to the soil health in your operation. And these are important because they impact how your soil functions and the pore size distribution in the soil and the soil connectivity. All right, so I told you I was going to talk to you about management impacts and soil moisture, so let's dig into it. How does residue impact soil moisture? All right, so in this study that they did in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, they looked at soil moisture at the 2-inch depth right at planting, or I guess at the time of tillage, until canopy closure. And what they found was in the reduced tillage systems, especially the no-till system, that system had less evaporation and more soil moisture. And this kind of makes sense. Tillage does aerate your soil, but it really disrupts all the pores within your soil. I do want to highlight though that in these reduced tillage systems, it's super important that you're managing your residue effectively. If you don't have even spread of your residue, you can get some pileup, it can cause issues with germination, and it can cause issues with just physically planting. So really important to make sure that you have good residue managers. And like I said before, it's pore connectivity that's super important for increasing our infiltration capacity. And if you look at these X-ray images, so basically they took these soil pores and they put them in this X-ray machine. So just like they can do that to our body, they can do the same thing to soil. It's super cool. It helps us look into the soil without disrupting the pores. And what you can see is that we have 3 different systems here. One of them is a chisel plow disc ripping system, which is the conventional system. We also have 2 no-till systems. One of them, the middle one, is a 29-year no-till system, so we've been doing this for quite a while. The other one is a 4-year no-till system. So you can see the differences in how this tillage system impacts soil pores when it's newer and kind of newly introduced versus something that's been there for a long time. And what you see is the red forest means that there's a lot of connectivity, and the green forest is not a lot of pore volume. And we see that in this top 0 to 4 inches, the conventional site has very little pore connectivity and has a bunch of these really, really tiny pores. Really good at holding water, but not very easy for your plant to actually access that water. In the no-till systems, we now see the better pore connectivity, and especially in that 29-year no-till system. So I don't need to show you this and say like, oh, it's going to take 29 years to see the benefits. I'm just trying to suggest that the benefits really accumulate over time, and if anything, maybe this is a little push to get started sooner rather than later. So you'll start seeing some of those benefits in your lifetime. So really impact those pore size distributions and then also the pore connectivity. But it's not just about total moisture. I keep saying that. I'm going to kind of be a broken record here. It's really about plant available water and trying to reduce crop stress, having enough soil moisture so that your crops are not stressed. And this is a study that they did in South Dakota. This is data from 2021. It was a relatively wetter year in South Dakota, and they were comparing different tillage systems. And what they were trying to do is show how long are these systems actually in that optimal soil moisture range where there's available plant water. So this green middle section is that plant available water, optimal soil moisture range. This red bar down here is where the plant is, the water is in these very tiny pores. It's basically a drought for the plant, you can't access the water. And the blue is when there's excessive water and you're kind of drowning out the plant. So in this wetter year, they saw that the no-till system outperformed the conventional till, so chisel plow and disc ripping system, in terms of the length of time that it was actually stable and at this moisture optimum. And remember, this is a wet year, so you probably care about how is water actually moving through the system. Well, the no-till system actually had spent less time being excessively wet than the conventional till site. I don't want to over-exaggerate the impacts though, obviously it's 34 to 38%, but still there is an overall increase in soil stability, moisture stability, just overall crop health, as you guys can see here. So to just summarize a couple of those slides about tillage, reducing tillage and residue management. If you are tilling your soil, you will increase evaporation, you will be aerating your soil, but you're going to decrease moisture and you're going to decrease the connectivity of your pores. And in the long run, the structure that you create through tillage is not stable. It's very vulnerable to breaking down with raindrops, some of the most destructive forces on Earth. And that's why it's really important to think about the larger picture, not just how much moisture is in your soil, but then the impact on soil water processes. So, we're disrupting the soil structure. We're getting a crust on our soil and really small aggregates, very few pores. We're also restricting water movement downward and root growth downward because we have a cloud pan. So it's really decreasing those big connected pores, And this is ultimately going to reduce your plant available water. All right, how about cover crops? Oh, I guess before I get too carried away, I have a quick question for you guys. Anyone know what this cover crop is? You can make a guess. Maybe hints grass. Yeah, annual rye. So, or annual ryegrass. So it's been growing in the greenhouses for a couple weeks now. It actually, so I know what they say, it's not always winter hardy, but I subjected this thing to -5-degree temperatures a couple weeks ago and actually came back very well. So maybe a little hardier than I expected. Anyway, cover crops can reduce soil moisture. And I wanted to show you really quick here where they did a bunch of studies. They have 5 different studies here. They looked at how much biomass were these cover crops actually producing and how much soil water was actually in the soil. The more biomass that you get, the longer amount of time you keep the soil covered with a living root, you're going to have a reduction in soil moisture. And I think that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, what does a plant need to grow? Water, sunlight, carbon dioxide. Well, if it's growing on the landscape, it's going to use moisture. But sometimes it doesn't impact soil moisture, which is a little weird, right? In 50% of these studies that we looked at, over 95 different soil moisture and cover crop studies, we saw that the soil moisture was not reduced by cover crops. Over half of the studies did not see any differences in the soil moisture. And what's incredibly important here is which soils did see the reduction in moisture. It was the finer, heavier clay soils where they actually saw a difference in cover crop impacts to moisture, where the cover crops were reducing the water in that soil. And this is probably a soil where people actually want to reduce soil moisture. So this is a good thing in that sense. And in the sandier, coarser soils where we really want to keep our moisture, we don't see many times that the cover crops decrease soil moisture. 1 out of 6 studies actually saw a decrease, but the rest of them were about the same in the moisture content. Why did we see such different impacts? There's like over 100 studies that I just included in my last 2 slides. Well, there's a couple. I hate to give you it in a typical extension answer. It depends what it does. It depends on the amount of biomass that's produced. So, the cover crop type, you're going to get a lot more growth with grasses. The rooting system, that's going to be more fibrous and extensive using that soil moisture. But then also the growing degree days. And this has a lot to do with when you actually get it planted, whether you're going to be interseeding it or if you're going to be planting it after corn grain harvest, you're going to have a completely different number of growing degree days, which will impact how much growth you actually get, and the density, and also there's successful establishment. If you put the seed out, but we don't get enough rain, or we don't have good seed-to-soil contact, we aren't really going to get that cover crop taking off or getting any growth. So we're not going to see a reduction in soil moisture. So local conditions do play a huge role. And I guess I put those 2 photos up there of just kind of showing you, like, if a cover crop is just a couple of inches tall, it's not going to reduce moisture as much as something that's like 3-4 feet tall. But I think a question that might be on a lot of folks' minds is, okay, well, but does the moisture reduction or lack thereof even impact my cash crop yields? Because that's really what you're trying to get after. So here's a study they did in Morris, Minnesota in 2008 and 2009. They were looking at this no-till system, so I'll clarify it is a no-till system. But they had 3 different treatments. One of them was a winter fallow treatment where they didn't have a cover crop. They had a killed rye treatment where they killed cereal rye 3 weeks prior to planting. And they also had a harvested forage treatment where they harvest that 2 days before the corn planting. And what they saw was in a normal rain year in 2008, there were no differences in cash crop yield and there were no differences in soil moisture at that 0 to 12 inch depth. But in 2009, it was a little bit of a drier year, right? So now we're going to see a little bit more crop stress. The only treatment where they actually saw a difference in soil moisture and cash crop yield was in the forage, the harvested cereal rye treatment. And again, this goes back to that thing I was saying about the growing degree days, the amount of plant growth that you're getting, the biomass. If you're leaving it on the landscape for a longer period of time, you're just going to lose more water. So that being said, if you are concerned about soil moisture, you're trying to conserve it, I think a common saying is, if it's dry, kill the rye. And this year it does look a little dry. I was looking at the drought monitor a couple days ago. We'll see what happens. I was driving up here and it's a little snowy and rainy. But keep that in mind. You want to time your determination with what your end goal is. If you're trying to reduce water use, you want to terminate a little earlier. So we'll see if this video works. Rather than watching paint dry, what if we watch grass grow? Essentially, I just wanted to show you really quick, only 30 seconds of this video, where they put these seeds down. You can see then their roots will start to grow through the soil. And what's interesting is the roots are not only pushing their way and creating holes in the soil, these holes that will remain, those are the pores, even after the cover crop is terminated, but then the roots are also creating soil structure and binding the particles into these aggregates. So it's creating pore structure and it's also creating soil structure. And that's really going to impact how water moves through the soil. All right. So in the long term though, cover crops, what are they really doing? When you guys are done, maybe later on, before lunch or sometime during, you should come up and check out this root box, kind of get a look at what's going on underground. But these roots, it's so cool. They're actually turning like almost a third of the carbon that they are producing through photosynthesis. They're releasing that through these roots to feed the microbes. The microbes are transforming nutrients in the soil into plant available forms, and they're also releasing these glues. And those glues are holding the soil structure in these small aggregates. And then the roots come in, and then they basically, try to swoop in on those small aggregates and make a much larger aggregate. And it's a really, really cool process that only happens when you have roots in the ground. So though all crops and all plants do release exudates, it's about making sure that you do that for as long of the year as possible, not just during the growing season. And kind of back to what I was saying about those microbial glues and those roots building the structure, you can see here that I'm literally holding up a root with all of the different aggregates around it. So that's why it's so important to have these roots in the soil, adding those organic matter binding agents, as well as just feeding the soil biology, the living soil that we're all working with. And aggregates are important because they improve infiltration and store water. So those soil water processes that we care a lot about, not only are we increasing those large transporting pores that move the water to the subsoil and increase our infiltration capacity, we're also storing water within the aggregates themselves. And as you can see here, the tilled ecosystem has a crust, a plow pan. You're really going to restrict water entry into the soil. And in the long run, you're not going to have much plant available water because it's all going to be held in those tiny pores where plants cannot extract that water. Versus this no-till system, which has been left relatively undisturbed. There's roots for the plants to decompose, there's these worm burrows, really nice, long, extensive connected pores. And this is really important. So while tillage technically does aerate the soil, it's a temporary impact, and ultimately it will decrease this water holding capacity and plant available water within your soil. So to summarize that whole cover crop section, yes, cover crops probably do reduce soil water at the wet times of the year, in the fall and in the spring, but then they probably increase water holding capacity in the dry times of the year. They're impacting soil water processes by feeding the soil microbes, which are then releasing those glues that are helping build soil structure. The roots themselves are building soil structure. And also, really important, is keeping your soil, your number one asset, in place. So reducing erosion. I got a great photo to show you guys later, but here in this photo you can see that those roots are really holding this place down. But what if you were to combine those practices and not just do them individually? So back to that South Dakota study where they had that optimum soil moisture curve where they were looking at how long are these systems actually in that optimal plant available moisture zone. And what they saw here was across the board, the no-till system just had greater amount of time in that optimal soil moisture zone. And this is especially important in this much drier year. So this is 2022. and it was much drier, so you really wanted to try to keep as much moisture as you could in the soil to reduce crop stress. And while no-till was the obviously superior winner to the conventional till in terms of maintaining that moisture stability, reducing crop stress, the cover crop did play a role too, though this was a little less important relative to the tillage. But as you can see, the system that won overall was going to be combining and stacking with practices, so not just individual practices themselves. So this is a photo I took in May of 2022 because we got really interested in knowing more about pores and how that influences how water is moving and how much water is available to the plant. So we found these two systems. They were the same soil type. They were just managed completely differently for the last 25 years. The soil on the left had been chisel plowed for 25 plus years, continuous corn year after year, left bare during the shoulder seasons. Whereas the soil on the right had been no-till for 25 plus years. They've been doing cover crops for about 18 years and doing alternative crops and trying to use manure where possible. So really doing 4 of the 5 different soil health practices. And you can just visually see this really stark contrast. I guess I'm curious to learn more about how this might impact soil pore structure and how water moves through the soil, but then also resiliency to rainfall events, resiliency to drought events as well. So we did take those samples because we were curious, and we were really interested in looking at the pore size distribution and plant available water. We had 2 different systems, we had 2 different locations we were looking at. The Blooming Prairie system, which you just saw in those photos, and we also had this Cannon City location, which was about 30 minutes away from those other sites. In the conventional system, in both sites, we saw that those systems had fewer large pores, so fewer water-moving pores and reduced infiltration capacity, and also much more of those small pores, so where water is not easy to extract. But in the soil health systems, we had these, we saw more of these blue large pores and these green color-coded medium pores. So really increasing infiltration capacity, but then also what we thought would be increasing plant available water. But hold up, if you look at this table, it's not quite that story that we like to tell. Because while we did see that difference in plant available water and an increase in the soil health site of Blooming Prairie, we didn't in Cannon City. And it made me think, why might that be the case? Well, one of the reasons that what we were thinking is because you're stacking the practices very effectively in the Blooming Prairie sites. You're doing 4 of the 5 different soil health principles, really making it work for your system for 25 plus years. Soil health practices like residue and cover crops will help increase water storage and plant available water as long as you're able to stack those practices effectively. And we also see a really great impact on soil health and other soil processes. And this is important kind of to put into just a simple sentence. No-till is really protecting the soil pores from being disrupted, and cover crops are building the pores or building the soil structure. So trying to use both of those practices effectively to really improve the health and longevity and productivity of your soil. All right, so back to our kind of starting home base here. We just talked a lot about how land management really does influence how your soil behaves, how it functions, and ultimately the amount of moisture in your soil and the amount of plant available water. And we talked that soil properties really aren't going to be changing. But in the last couple of years that I've been working around the state of Minnesota, I've been seeing some pretty wild weather whiplash type of events. I'm sure you're all used to it or have seen some of these things, but we're getting a lot of rain, primarily in this time of the year where we don't necessarily have our soils covered. Because we are great at growing the corn and the soybeans during April, May, September, October, November, but we're getting a lot of the rain in that shoulder season where the ground is typically bare. We're also seeing that there's greater drought stress. At least in the area that I've been, it's been really dry. We're not getting a lot of rainfall in that summertime when the crops really need that moisture. So all these practices together, you really need to try to find a way where let's keep our soils and our crops resilient by increasing the plant available water, the water holding capacity, the pore size distribution, pore connectivity, really just have a good mix of these soil water processes to keep water in the soil when you need it, but then move water when you don't. And here is why that is so important. Because when we don't have our soils covered, we get a lot of erosion. You know, wind and water erosion and tillage erosion too. I'm more so relating this to kind of some of the water erosion things, but you know, wind is applicable as well. But that topsoil, that dark, organic matter-rich soil, that's the good stuff, right? That's the most productive part of your soil. It's rich in nutrients, organic matter, soil biology, the most active part of our soil. And that took over 10,000 years to form from prairie roots and shoots, continuous life and death within the soil, really feeding that ecosystem, the organic matter is coating the soil particles. But if that topsoil, that organic matter-rich, most productive part of our soils blows away, we'll have to farm the subsoil if we can. I see a lot of eroded knolls in southern Minnesota where they just really can't grow much because it's subsoil, high in clay, it's much less fertile, and it's much more expensive to even try to farm because you have to apply so many more inputs. So takeaways, you know, yes, the cover crops, the residue, they do have an impact on soil moisture, they do have an impact on soil water behavior, but that message I love to stress is that practices that protect your number one asset, the soil and the soil pores, are incredibly important for increasing your resilience, especially as we're getting these pretty dry summers and pretty wet and intense rainfall falls and springs. And bottom line, we just simply cannot afford to lose this much topsoil. It is not profitable or productive to not have the most productive part of your soil get blown off and end up in your neighbor's field. So, as you can see, even if you only do a winter kill cover crop, such as radishes, there's a huge difference in that water erosion, where the no cover crop, there's this big, this gully beginning to form, I guess real erosion, sheet erosion, where the right-hand side, that's looking pretty good, even though there isn't a lot of residue. It's because those roots are still in the soil. And I want to make one quick plug with the last couple minutes of my time here. So I saw a couple of you say you tried cover crops before. Did any of you plant any cover crops this fall? Okay, well, if you want to make some money, I got an opportunity. It's this Great Lakes Cover Crop Project, and I'll have some flyers in the back, and I'll be around for some time today. We are looking for farmers who are willing to give us a little bit of information just on how they manage their cover crop, but we're going to keep all data anonymous. It's really important to us that we keep it anonymous, but we know that we're hearing from a lot of people that they want more local data. They want to know how things are looking, how things are growing, and so this is an opportunity where you take 20 minutes to do a management survey, and then we would ask that you take a photo of the cover crop in the spring, right before you terminate it. So any farmer is eligible as long as they have an overwintering cover crop. And we'll pay up to $50 per field, and you can do this for up to 3 fields, though you can enroll more. You just can't pay past 150 bucks. But in exchange, you'll get the money, and we'll also give you a biomass and nutrient estimate report. So it might be some useful information, and you'll help us build out a tool where we can try to show some cover crop data that people really want to see, rather than just these research and outreach center plant trials. So I'll have this in the back, and feel free to come and find me afterwards. Otherwise, scan this code and you should be able to pull up the site. Okay, so I will leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions, comments, just ideas. And I do look forward to any questions you have. Otherwise, feel free to reach out if it's not now, later. Yeah, there's my email, my contact information. And yeah, just glad I could be out here, and thanks again for listening in.